Rushanara, please.
Good afternoon. I mean, what a fascinating set of contributions already. Thank you very much. I wanted to pick up on the point made about £200 billion over 5 years. And of course, if you're on the centre left, what's not to like? To be able to pay back, everyone's saying taxes are going to have to go up at some point. People are very concerned, especially those who've had 10 years of austerity and no pay rise in our constituencies, and are very concerned that the consequences of COVID and the borrowing that's necessary is that the books are going to be balanced on the backs of the poorest. I wonder if perhaps I could start with Aaron, because given your role in the Tax Commission, can you talk through what precisely, the 200, what it would take to raise 200 billion over the 5-year period that Robert was referring to, and how that could be done without the sort of risks that have been explained, highlighted by Tim and also Edward?
So I think one of the kind of key distinctions to make here is, once we say we want a wealth tax, meaning, suppose you want a wealth tax, we've said that meaning a tax on the net wealth that people have in the country just for owning wealth, not based on the income or anything else they have. We still have to decide how exactly you design it. And I think the kind of numbers that Robert was referring to was in the context of, you could, for example, have a one-off wealth tax. So one-off wealth tax would say, look, we want to raise a lot of money, over a short period of time. What we're going to do is, if you wanted to say 200 billion, you could say, design that as a 4% tax on all of the wealth that people have above the first £500,000 of net wealth they have. So, if you have a house, but you have a mortgage, you take that off the value of the house. So that would cover about 7 million people in the country. 15% of the adults would be covered by something like that. And you could say pay that off over 5 years. So that would be 0.8% of their wealth per year. And something like that would raise something like 200 billion. That is importantly saying that you're not giving any discounts for excluding homes or pensions, which are the kind of things that people sometimes talk about. So it is very important, if you're thinking about something like this, and you want that kind of level of revenue, that you're not excluding certain assets, because doing that is saying instead you're loading more tax onto the remaining assets. So saying that, say, people with businesses are having to pay more tax if you were trying to exclude some of those assets. So that's one thing to take into account. The other thing about a one-off tax relative to an annual tax is it's in one sense more straightforward, because you will say, we've set some date, it's happened in the past, so you have no chance to change your behavior and avoid it and do all of the things that one might worry about. It's based on, we know that 2020 was a bad year for many people, so we'll pick a date in 2020 and say that was the date that we set as the value of your wealth at that point is what we're using. If you were lucky enough that your wealth was high at that point, you're going to be contributing something. If you were unlucky and your wealth was low at that point, fortunately for you, you're not going to be one of the people who's contributing something, but it minimizes your ability to avoid the tax because you can't change anything, it's the past. It's measured at some point in time, and you're then being asked over a period in time. Alternatively, you can design these things as an annual tax. That means you're going to raise the money kind of continuously, so you get more money over the longer term in principle. But then you have to think carefully about all of the avoidance issues, clearly, because and kind of mitigation issues that people will want to respond.
Is there a case for doing it over a longer period of time? And also, the historic arguments have been that this is going to disincentivize the wealth creators. I probably sound like a Thatcher right now, but those are what opponents, my opponents to this argument, would say. I'm very clear that there is probably a case for a wealth tax alongside other taxes, because if we are to believe and accept the arguments that analysts are making, that the tax base will have to still be increased from across the board in society. But the issue is, how do you make sure it's just and it is generally fits with a levelling up agenda, as opposed to that being just rhetoric, frankly, to win elections. So the question is, should it be over a longer period of time? And also, what else, how would you, those of you who are proponents of a wealth tax, how would you counter the arguments that have already been made, but also complexity, dead weight and so on, but also about the wealth creators, a mass exodus of the wealthy of our society to, I don't know, all the Cayman Islands or wherever it is that is a heaven or haven for them? How do you do that? And perhaps Emma can come in, and Aaron, if you could briefly address that. If there's anything else you want to add.
So let me disclaim being a proponent of a wealth tax and say that I'm, the project that we've been doing is studying how could you make it happen if you wanted to? We're not there to say either it's a brilliant idea and we're trying to make you have to do it, or saying you shouldn't.
Sure.
But on that kind of proviso, I think in terms of bringing the money in over a longer period, certainly you could say set whatever the tax rate was at some point in time and allow the payment period to be longer. The key risk with doing that is the longer you let that period be, the more kind of unreasonable in some ways it looks to say, well, I'm charging you based on the wealth you had in 2020, despite the fact that it might have changed quite a lot over some, over the following 5 or 10 years. So if you said a 10-year period, I mean, I should say Germany had a fairly successful in the 1950s. West Germany had a fairly successful one-off wealth tax as a response to the the World War, and they had a payment period of 30 years. So you can do something like that. They also had an extremely high rate for that tax. But doing that, obviously creates pressure if people want to revalue. On this point about the wealth creators, I think, again, this is where the one-off wealth tax doesn't change your incentives in the future for wealth creation. Clearly, an annual wealth tax does, but then all taxes, you should remember, change behavior. As much as we should be worried about taxes on wealth damaging kind of incentives to create wealth, taxes on labor damage the incentives for people to work for the wealth creators. So I think, any tax is going to have some response effectively.
Emma Chamberlain, would you like to come in?
I mean, I think it is important to distinguish between quite a lot of complexity and administrative problems with an annual wealth tax, where I have been persuaded that that is really quite difficult to deliver, and in practice I am doubtful, like Edward is, about whether you could either improve inequality or deliver revenue. I think the arguments for a one-off wealth tax, although actually I was very sceptical, as Dr. Advani knows, at the beginning about a one-off wealth tax and quite opposed to it, I have come around much more to it, and I do think it could raise a large amount of revenue much more efficiently than many other tax rises, and it could be targeted. How do we deal with people leaving? Well, of course, if it's a one-off wealth tax that's retrospective to a past date, that point has been and gone. I think you'd have to be a bit careful if you have a one-off wealth tax that's retrospective, that you don't tax someone who's only been here a year and they just happen to have arrived in 2020 and they leave in 2021. That seems a bit unfair. And we are looking at the design of that sort of proposal. If you had a one-off wealth tax, how you would deal with it. Just an answer, Robert mentioned the need for a broad base, which I absolutely agree with, but he also talked about a higher threshold. And Dr. Advani was talking about a 500,000 threshold. If we're going with individual rather than household taxation, which for design reasons I think we're probably going to end up with, that's about £1 million per couple, really. And at that level is that you get to the 200 billion or 250 billion over 5 years. So I think in terms of an annual wealth tax, you could design it. And I've set a lot of this out in one of the papers about stopping people leaving, or if they do leave, they still have to pay for a period after they've left. All of this is complex and it's quite difficult to enforce in some ways. And if you're going to introduce a wealth tax, you sort of want to keep it quite simple. And I would always prefer a lower threshold because I think it leads to less avoidance. If you have a higher threshold, you will get more avoidance around that.
Right, interesting. Edward Troop, Sir Edward, do you want to come in? I mean, you talked about complexity. You also talked about VAT being an easy win, easy way, but we all know about the disproportionate effect that has and the kind of unjust nature of it in terms of the impact on the poorest. And of course, there's lots of evidence to suggest it would be better not to have exclusions in VAT. So can you sort of talk through how you think a policy like that might generate 250 billion? What is the sensible way of doing this that addresses some of the concerns that you and Tim, and perhaps Tim can come in afterwards, have raised? Is there a way in which we can build a coalition around a proposal that is workable, that people can come to terms with? So that we don't end up in the same situation where poorer people are having to face the tax burden, whether it's through VAT increases, which is the easy option that successive governments can take. And also, if you weren't proposing, either of you, we wouldn't accept or think that it's a good idea to have a wealth tax, then is there a case for a kind of the equivalent of the war bonds, where I know the returns were low, but are there alternatives that should be looked at in terms of looking at investment rather than tax from society, members of society, given that the coronavirus crisis is even worse than the global financial crisis? Sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry, it keeps muting itself. Apologies. I'm sorry, there are a lot of questions there and I won't answer them all. Just to say that the points I was making or was trying to make are twofold. First of all, if you want big money, you have to go for the big taxes. And the case for this being a big tax has not been made. That's the first point. And therefore, VAT, income tax and NICs will have to be in the mix to raise the sort of money that needs to be raised. That's a political, fiscal decision as to whether you're raising tax, raising borrowing or cutting spending. The second point, which is a combination of political economy, pragmatism and administration, is how the balance of the tax system looks so that it is perceived as fair and you maintain the support and trust of the population as a whole. That is a political judgment. Do you need taxes, specifically on the wealthy, in order to sell politically the broad taxes on everybody? Because there are going to have to be broad taxes if you're going to raise this sort of money.
Yeah. So the answer is, would you say that the answer is yes, that you do need a mix?
Yes, you do need a mix.
Yeah. So that would in that equation, it does need to be something akin to a wealth tax or some form of.
I'm not being drawn into what that mix might look like.
Okay, Tim, did you want to conclude? Did you want to add any points to
Yes, please. I mean, I'm unconvinced of this argument that we need to be raising taxes. I mean, yes, we've just spent an enormous amount of money on dealing with the coronavirus. And, depending on how we unwind QE or don't unwind QE, then we may or may not need more tax revenue in the future. Once the vaccines are out, once the economy's returned to normal, I don't actually see the case for higher taxation and more government spending because the problem will be behind us. So I'm not even buying that first stage of the argument here that we need to have more taxes. The other thing that sort of just struck me is that people are talking about retrospective one-off wealth taxes. Well, one-off wealth taxes aren't all that good an idea simply because once it's happened once, absolutely nobody is ever going to believe that it won't be done again. That's just the way people react to government doing things. But the other thing is a retroactive tax. Okay, currently, if the Chancellor stands up, Rishi stands up and says, well, I'm raising income tax, then everybody has a choice of saying, well, I'm going to go to work or I'm not going to work. I agree to pay that tax or I don't agree to pay that tax. A retroactive tax is an appalling idea. It's akin to theft. I mean, Roy Jenkins did this in the 1960s. He imposed 130% tax at the top end of capital incomes, retroactively on the previous tax year that was already closed. I mean, that's just an appalling behavior. However much government needs the money, it's just not what we should be doing. Tax, just like any other form of law, should be, it starts today. If you don't agree with it, then you can change your behavior in the future to avoid it, not do the activity, whatever. But actually taxing people today on what they did last year, changing the law on them, I regard that as an appalling breach of civil liberty, breach of civil rights.
Tim, can I just stop you there, because we're going to have to move on to our next question, but just on that important point about retroactivity, I'm not entirely convinced that the suggestion here was that. It seemed to me it was a kind of benchmarking of wealth at an earlier date rather than, and I see Aaron nodding, so I won't bring Aaron in because I think I probably made the point that he was going to make. But let's move on, please, to Julie. Thank you.